breathtaking modern urban architecture, the multicoloured library in Peckham in South London, the Visitors Centre at Cardiff Bay, and the London Underground station at North Greenwich by the Millennium Dome. Two of his latest projects are master plans for redeveloping Bradford and Barnsley into futuristic cityscapes. So, if it was his decision, would he knock down Middlesbrough's Victorian terraces?
That's a very difficult question to answer because I don't know the exact background, but certainly if it was my decision or if I'd been asked to think about providing new housing in that area, and I suspect that it probably needs it, I wouldn't have gone about it in the way that they did. And certainly I'd have gone into a process to involve the people that were living there and the slightly wider community to actually find out what sort of new bit of a city that they would like.
But you do see a future, do you, for traditional Victorian or whatever they may be terraces, if that's where people are still living and where they want to stay on?
I think if they're in good condition, I certainly see a future for that, and I also see that there are strategies for building new buildings alongside those existing buildings so that we actually get a very rich mix of the old and hopefully the very good quality new alongside. And the whole point of that is to get more people living in the middle of our cities rather than on the edge of new housing estates.
So in your mind then, what is the key? If the goal is to persuade people that it can be an attractive proposition to live in the centre of an established city, what's the one thing you have to provide for them?
What you have to provide for them is a sense of ownership. What I have discovered in working in places like Barnsley and Bradford and certainly in East Manchester, where we are knocking people's houses down as we speak, what they want is they want their place to be unique, they want to have an identity, and where they value their homes, they want to keep them. And if they're not in particularly good condition, then you have to put some money into repairing those homes. But it doesn't actually deny the very good idea, which is to increase the density, because certainly in the face of expanding many of the towns, particularly in the north of England, we're faced with building on greenfields and housing estates, and the net result of that is you house people, they have no connection with the centre of that town in which they live in.
If one looks back at the kind of urban housing developments that characterised, let's say, the 60s and early 70s, clearly there were great visions that architects had at that time, but very often, when it came to the reality, what they provided were living conditions which were not attractive to people. Now, how do you avoid making the same mistake again?
Well, we're not in the 60s and 70s, and I'd be the first to agree with you. There was lots of disasters because people were not consulted in any way or involved in that process. I think that architects, generally speaking, not all, are much more sensitive these days. I think the investors are much more sensitive. There are some very good ones around. There's also, sadly, some very bad ones, and maybe in Middlesbrough they've got one of the less sensitive ones.
But given the economic realities of the country in which we live, in which many of the job opportunities increasingly are in the south part of the country, people tend to leave the north and head south, it takes more than architecture and urban master plans, doesn't it, to persuade them to stay in the north?
I think it does take more than that, and there are all sorts of other incentives which are beyond the humble realms of the architect and urban designer.
But the humble architect can play his part?
Certainly can, and I think it's a very important part. To have a sense of place, to make somewhere that people would like to live and work in and be educated in, is half the battle.
The